Welcome to the Richard Syrett Show. Stephen Guilbeault, Canada's Minister of Canadian Identity, Culture and Official Languages, is a convicted felon and a walking insult to anyone with a shred of historical literacy. His latest ex-post on Friday is a masterclass in idiocy, droning on about Emancipation Day and Canada's supposed history of slavery and enduring anti-black racism. This claptrap is so divorced from reality it could star in a comedy special, if only it weren't so dangerous. The Liberal government, led by this intellectual featherweight, is hell-bent on importing America's racial politics, slapping a Canadian flag on it, and calling it inclusion. But the truth, as laid bare by the Aristotle Foundation's Slavery in Canada, the Facts Rarely Told, is far uglier, far messier, and far less convenient for their sanctimonious narrative. Canada was not built on slavery, and no amount of woke posturing will rewrite that fact. Let's start with Guilbeault's ex-post, shall we? He wants us to, quote, reflect on how people of African descent shaped our inclusive identity, end quote. Sounds heartwarming, except it's built on a lie so flimsy it collapses under the weight of a calendar. The British Empire abolished slavery in 1834. That's 33 years before Canada became a nation in 1867. That's not a typo, Stephen. It's basic arithmetic. Canada did not exist as a country when slavery was outlawed across the empire. Yet here's our Minister of Identity peddling a narrative that assumes Canadians are too dim to check the dates. Slavery is a grotesque stain on human history, no question. But Canada's story isn't the American nightmare of mass chattel slavery. The United States enslaved 10 million people from 1619 to 1865. Canada, roughly 7,500 slaves, Indigenous and black combined, over a similar period. 10 million slaves in the U.S., 7,500 in Canada. That's not a rounding error. It's a fundamentally different reality. Now, here's where the woke brigade in Ottawa starts sweating. The Aristotle Foundation's report drops a bombshell. Slavery wasn't just a European import. It was woven into indigenous cultures long before any colonists set foot here. Vast indigenous slave networks stretched from the Missouri River Basin to the Great Lakes, trading captives for wealth, weapons, and power. In New France, 65% of slaves were indigenous, stolen and bartered along routes plied by the Huron, Iroquois, and others. So if we're applying the same moral lens to colonial societies, dozens of First Nations were knee-deep in slavery. But don't expect Guilbeault to mention that. It shatters the indigenous way of knowing dogma the Liberals worship like a sacred cow. And it didn't vanish when the British banned slavery in 1834. Indigenous slavery lingered, especially on the Pacific coast. Take Makina, a Nucha-Nulth chief, who in 1803 massacred an English ship's crew and enslaved the two survivors alongside indigenous captives for over 2 years. Or Haida chief Albert Edward Edansa, born in 1810. By 1883, 12 years after British Columbia joined Confederation, 18 years after the American Civil War, and half a century after abolition, he was still holding slaves. The Pacific Coast was a slavery hotspot, pre- and post-Confederation, and it wasn't just the white man's doing. This isn't sanitizing history. It's exposing it, raw and unfiltered, in a way the Liberals refuse to touch because it complicates their tidy victim-oppressor script. The colonists weren't choir boys, let's be clear. They bought slaves from indigenous suppliers, and New France saw a surge in the trade by the 18th century. Historian Marcel Trudel estimates 4,185 slaves, mostly indigenous, in what became Lower Canada from the 1600s to 1834. In Upper Canada and the Maritimes, up to 3,200 black slaves arrived after the American War of Independence, alongside 3,000 black loyalists who faced crude bigotry, even race riots in places like Shelburne, Nova Scotia. That's ugly, and it deserves to be confronted. But pretending Canada's history mirrors America's original sin is intellectual fraud. Our economy, politics, and culture weren't forged in the fires of slavery. The biggest impact slavery had here was indirect, sparking the American Civil War, which nudged our leaders toward Confederation to avoid getting sucked into their chaos. So why is Guilbeault pushing this garbage? Because the liberals are addicted to America's racial politics, importing it lock, stock, and barrel to score woke points. They see the U.S. reckoning and think, let's copy-paste that. Never mind that it distorts our history. Never mind that indigenous slavery was more impactful and longer lasting than the European kind here. Never mind that Canada's story is one of scattered, small-scale human trafficking, not the systemic horror of the American South. Facts don't matter to this government. Optics do. They want to signal they're morally superior, even if it means lying about who we are. The irony is thicker than a Canadian winter. Guilbeault, a man with a criminal record and a knack for saying stupid things, is tasked with defining Canadian identity. He's telling us our nation is steeped in anti-black racism and a slave-built legacy, stoking guilt and division where it doesn't belong. That's not inclusion, it's betrayal. He's telling kids Canada is rotten to the core, ignoring that we were a refuge for thousands escaping American slavery via the Underground Railroad. But that doesn't fit the script, so it's buried under buzzwords like systemic racism and decolonization. This government has turned history into a weapon, not a lesson. They've made a sport of pandering to every woke cause, from tearing down statues of our founders to rewriting curricula to guilt-trip kids into thinking Canada is a cesspool of oppression. They cherry-pick the past, ignoring inconvenient truths like Indigenous slave networks, or the fact that Canada was a beacon for those fleeing American slavery. The Aristotle Report is a wake-up call, but don't expect Ottawa to read it. They're too busy tweeting platitudes and polishing their halos. If they did, they'd have to admit their Americanized narrative is bunk. Canada wasn't built on slavery, and pretending it was cheapens the real suffering of those who endured it, here and elsewhere. So let's dig deeper into the liberal playbook. This isn't just about Guilbeault's ex-post. It's about a broader agenda to reshape Canada into something it's not. They've turned our educational system into a factory of self-loathing, teaching kids to apologize for their country rather than understand it. They've elevated Indigenous ways of knowing to a sacred status, but conveniently ignored the parts of Indigenous history, like slavery, that don't fit their narrative. They're obsessed with importing American guilt as if Canada's own story isn't complex enough. The result? A generation of young Canadians who think their country is defined by shame, not resilience, ingenuity, or the hard-won progress of a nation that, yes, has flaws, but also has a hell of a lot to be proud of. And don't get me started on the hypocrisy. The Liberals love to lecture about inclusion while fostering division with their imported racial politics. They'll cry about anti-black racism, but stay silent on the complexities of Indigenous slavery because that might offend their carefully curated coalition of activists. They'll tear down John A. Macdonald statues, but won't touch the legacy of chiefs like Etta Nsa, who held slaves decades after Confederation. Why? Because it's easier to vilify dead white guys than to grapple with the messy reality of history. It's selective outrage, and it's as dishonest as it gets. Here's my challenge to Guilbeault and his woke warriors. Stop lying to us. Stop pretending Canada's history is America's twin. Acknowledge the British abolition of 1834, the Indigenous slave networks that outlasted it, and the small scale of slavery compared to the U.S. Tell the whole story, warts, complexities, and all. Stop using history as a prop for your virtue signaling. And to Canadians, don't let these clowns redefine who we are. Our history is flawed, but rich with moments of courage, like the Underground Railroad or the push for Confederation to keep Canada free from American turmoil. We don't need to grovel before a foreign narrative to prove we're decent people. Demand better from this government. Demand truth over ideology. Remind Guilbeault that being Minister of Canadian Identity means knowing what Canada actually is, not what you wish it was to score points with the woke mob. Read a history book, Stephen, and maybe you'll learn something. Until then, Canadians deserve better than your lies.